Today, I'm at the headquarters of Médecins sans Frontières, one of the biggest and best-known medical humanitarian organizations in the world. MSF, which was present at the start of modern humanitarian action, is currently celebrating its 40th anniversary, and we have decided to use the occasion to explain just how this NGO came to find itself at the heart of international relations, as both a product and a key player, and how its actions reflect 40 years of international political history. The story of humanitarian action began in the early 70s. In the space of a few months, the world was shaken by a series of major crises that prompted large-scale relief operations, due largely to unprecedented media attention. The earthquake in Peru in May 1970, the cyclone in eastern Pakistan in December of the same year, the secession of East Pakistan, which became Bangladesh in 1971, and then the Biafran War in Nigeria, the event considered to be behind the founding of Médecins sans Frontières. So let's focus on this conflict for a moment. This is a map of Nigeria. In May 1967, Colonel Ojukwu, the Eastern Region's military governor, proclaimed the Republic of Biafra, with Enugu as the capital. To understand this secessionist movement, you need to know that this region is home to the Igbo people, who formed about 19% of the Nigerian population at the time. It also holds 2/3 of the country's oil fields. In other words, most of Nigeria's wealth. The Nigerian government's reaction was immediate and uncompromising. It would break the secessionists by depriving them of their popular support. And so Lagos imposed a total blockade on Biafra, plunging the population into famine. In 3 years, the armed conflict combined with the famine caused the death of 2 million people in Biafra. And since the 70s was also the era when in-depth reporting of world events really took off, it found itself in the media spotlight, generating intense emotion among a general public not yet accustomed to the kind of pictures it was seeing.
Voilà, je sais. Je sais, ces images sont insupportables.
But aid was having trouble getting through as the conflict was unfolding within Nigeria's borders. The government in Lagos was refusing any foreign presence and, as international law prohibits any interference in a country's internal affairs, international public institutions could only stand by and watch. It was this paralysis of institutional actors that prompted a group of French doctors, former Red Cross workers, and a handful of emergency medicine specialists to start looking at other ways of bringing relief to victims of conflict, famine, and natural disasters. Assembled in Paris on the 21st of December 1971 by the medical review Tonus, they set up an aid organization that was to be called Médecins sans Frontières. MSF's operational history really began in 1975 during the Cold War, which had been claiming an increasing number of victims. On this map of the world in 1975, you can see the members of NATO and their allies in blue, the members of the Warsaw Pact and countries with pro-Soviet regimes in red. And now let's add to the map what we used to call the proxy wars, or in other words, guerrilla-type conflicts or civil wars which were playing out the confrontation between the USSR and the United States. In Mozambique or Angola, for example, the pro-Soviet regimes in Maputo and Luanda were fighting guerrilla movements receiving support from the Americans. In the Central American countries, on the other hand, where the governments in power were allies of the United States, the Soviets were supporting Marxist rebels such as the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. These conflicts have two other points in common. They were all taking place within the borders of the countries concerned, and they were all, or almost all, causing the large-scale exodus of refugees. The number of refugees went up from 3 million in 1976 to 11 million in 1983, and 90% of them were fleeing communist regimes. Much of MSF's action therefore became focused on these Cold War conflicts, because where public actors were usually unable to go, those without borders could assert their independence and their neutrality in the field. So they were in a position to intervene in the name of a population's right to assistance and in the name of human rights. And they did just that for the first time during the conflict in Cambodia. On 17th of April 1975, Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge seized power in Phnom Penh. A first wave of refugees fled the country for Thailand, where camps were set up along the border. At this point, MSF doctors confined themselves to supporting other organizations, such as the International Rescue Committee, for example, in the Aranya Pratet camp. 4 years later, in 1979, the arrival of the Vietnam People's Army in Phnom Penh triggered a second wave of refugees who fled to the camps of Khao Yi Dang, Sakio, Kamput, and Meerut. According to the UNHCR, there were 300,000 Cambodian refugees along the Thai border. This time, given the extent of the needs, MSF decided to set up its own operational, medical and logistical base. After a while, it was managing everything: care, immunization, water, hygiene, as well as shelters and nutrition. And this has been its strength ever since. Meanwhile, in the face of testimonies from the refugees about the atrocities taking place in Cambodia, MSF's management decided, for the first time, to suspend their confidentiality undertaking. In February 1980, they launched the Walk for the Survival of Cambodia, an aid convoy that wanted to cross the border between Cambodia and Thailand, or alternatively between Thailand and Cambodia, to alert public opinion to what they believed was a famine in Cambodia. From this point on, MSF adopted speaking out, or témoignage, as a means of action in its own right. When it's the only witness to human rights violations, it can amount to a responsibility. The media, communication campaigns, and pictures are essential tools for MSF, whose independence relies on the support of private donors and the general public. So from this point of view, its action in Afghanistan in the 80s was entirely emblematic. In December 1979, Soviet troops invaded Afghanistan and installed a pro-Soviet regime. An Afghan resistance movement formed, gained strength and was supported by the Mujahideen, who are being trained and financed by the Pakistani and then the American secret services. The civilian population in many parts of Afghanistan quickly found itself destitute. To provide them assistance, small medical teams from MSF crossed the border from Pakistan into Afghanistan and, where the warlords accepted their presence, began working in the areas held by the resistance. These teams were small and working without logistical backup, so their medical impact was minimal. But the accounts they gave of what the Red Army was doing in Afghanistan had a significant impact on public opinion in the West. As these new humanitarian troubleshooters began to return from the field, their testimony began to coalesce into a sort of ethical code of commitment and courage, placing humanitarian action firmly in the human rights circle and distancing it from the third worldism politics of traditional aid and development organizations.